1 through 6. Warning to the rich. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you.
That is a daunting passage of Scripture to be preaching on. And when Brian asked me to preach on that one, I'm like, thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. The thing is, it's a difficult passage, and sometimes we can, if we're not careful, we want to disconnect from it. And this morning I would challenge you to, rather than pull back from the intensity of that passage, kind of lean into it, because I feel God has a message for us that he wants us to hear. So it's a little uncomfortable, right? But it's through the uncomfortableness in life that God changes us, that he challenges us to grow and to become better. So with that said, how many of you have ever had someone ask you for advice? Anyone? Anyone ever ask you for advice? Like maybe it's a friend wanting advice on their new outfit or their new hairdo, or maybe it's like, hey, I'm dating this one individual. What do you think? Aren't they the greatest? Or it might be a coworker. They've been given an assignment at work and they want your input. You know, hey, this is what I'm working on. This is what I have so far. What do you think? Those of you who are parents, how many of you have had your kids come to you and ask for help with homework? And they come to you and it's this essay that they're writing and they're like, it's great. It's perfect, right? And they want your advice on giving the thumb of approval to what they've written or what they've done. And we can go one of two ways. We either tend to try to avoid answering by redirecting. Oh, yeah, he's a wonderful person. How long have you been dating? Maybe you should, take your time. You know, we don't want to encourage them, and we don't want to answer the question because we're afraid that if we're too honest, we might offend. Same way with your kids or whatever. It's like, that is this what you intended to write? You know, I mean, we don't want to offend them. I can think back to a story or a time in my life where new parents, right? What does every new parent do with their baby? They want to show off their baby because they're proud of their baby. I had this one friend, I hate to admit it, but their baby was ugly. It was the most hideous baby I've ever seen, and they come up and they're just like, oh, isn't he just adorable? And wow, he's got your eyes. Yeah, that's a baby, you know. And you try to answer without actually answering because you don't want to offend. Because, right, as Christians, we want to be truthful. So we try not to intentionally lie, but we try sometimes not to answer also. On the flip side, sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes we can be a little too direct, right? I mean, we go in and we just blurt it out. We tell them exactly what we think or what the truth is. And sometimes inadvertently we do hurt people's feelings. In like manner, I can remember very clearly one Thanksgiving, went to my mom's for Thanksgiving, and God bless her, she cannot cook worth a darn. She could ruin a pot of boiling water. I mean, my mom could not cook. And so I show up for Thanksgiving, and I'm looking forward to, the turkey. Stuffing is my favorite part. Big. I'll eat like an entire plate of nothing but stuffing. A little bit of gravy on top, some cranberry relish. And I show up, and I'm helping my mom get everything set up, and she hands me this platter, and there's this bluish gray stuff. And I'm like, what is this? She's like, well, that's the stuffing. It's this buckwheat wild grain rice stuffing I made. And without even thinking, I'm just like, Mom, that is hideous. No one wants to eat that. And I could see her face just drop. And I was like, oh, sorry. Sometimes we can be a little too direct. In the passage we're going to look at this morning, James is direct. He is very blunt. He's very direct. He doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't pull his punches. He goes straight to the point. And he does it in a way because he doesn't want to offend, but at the same time, he's more concerned about getting the point across. He's wanting to make sure that we don't miss what he's trying to say. And unfortunately, it's so direct that we have this tendency where we will pull back. Or we have a tendency, it's like, oh, he's talking to the rich. I'm not rich, so therefore it doesn't apply to me, right? Or we have this attitude, it's like, oh, great, here we go again, talking about money in church, and we want to just disconnect completely and check out. Here's the thing, though. Luke chapter 16, verse 13 says, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The fact is, in our lives, we're either going to worship money as our God, or we're going to worship God with our money. One of those two. Money is not, we try to keep money separate from the religious. We want to keep money in the secular, the non-religious part of our life. But money permeates everything. And money is very well integrated into the spiritual. And we're either going to worship money as our God, or we're going to worship God with our money. In the passage that James is talking about, though, what he's looking at is he wants us to examine our motives, wanting us to examine our heart and our attitude towards money. And he's going to be addressing two attitudes that as believers we can fall into. And they're wrong attitudes about money. But even though it's a hard passage we're going to be looking at, I don't want to leave us just with two bad attitudes about money and therefore, bless God, deal with it. There's also, after we go through the two attitudes that James addresses, I'm going to go through and I'm going to give us a third option. And it's a view that it permeates throughout the entire width of the Bible. And it's a view of what, as Christians, the correct godly attitude we should have towards money. So, let's start off. The first one, I like to refer to it as the sin of selfishness. This is the attitude of what's mine is mine. I worked hard for this. It's mine. I don't have to share it with anyone. And I'm going to keep all of it, right? James chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last days. I want to start off right away, though, by saying God is not against the rich. God is not against you being rich or having stuff or being blessed. Sometimes in church we have this attitude that, anyone ever else here, that money is the root of all evil? Right? We hear it all the time, but that's actually not quite what the Bible says. The Bible says it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And if we're not careful, we can sometimes view money itself as being evil. But throughout Scripture, the Bible gives us actually 4 categories of people in the Bible and how money relates to them. We have what we can refer to as the ungodly rich and the godly rich. You can be rich and be ungodly. You can be rich and be godly. In the same way, you can be poor and ungodly or poor and godly. Right? Some examples of the ungodly rich. We can go through the Bible and look at lots of examples of a lot of the rulers and the Sadducees and Pharisees and everyone else who had power and influence, and they just abused and took advantage of the people. In the same manner, we can also look at people throughout the Bible and look at like Abraham, richly blessed by God. King David, blessed by God. And the Bible describes him as a man after God's own heart. On the flip side, we can also look at the poor. And I can think of one person who was the most godly poor person throughout history. In fact, he was so poor, he was born in a barn. Right? We're talking about Jesus. I mean, he came from heaven, the richest place of all, and he set it all aside to come and to live with a family that was poor. So whether you're rich or poor doesn't have any impact upon your spirituality. It's all about your attitude. So I just wanted to start off and be clear about that to begin with. But see, God gives us our worldly possessions so that we can honor him and do good with them. Otherwise, what happens is if we're not honoring God with our possessions, they tend to own us. And we begin to put our trust in our possessions and our things rather than in God. So, this sin of selfishness, you can call it like a sin of hoarding. It's grabbing all that you can, getting all that you have and canning it, and then sitting on the can, refusing to share with anyone. It's I'm going to receive, I'm going to grab all that I can because I'm going to just milk this life for all that it's worth, and I'm going to just keep it all for myself. James addresses three categories of this in this passage we looked at. The first one, he refers to it as your riches will rot. In this era, in this culture at the time, their riches were agricultural. They were an agricultural community, so their riches were their grain, their cattle, basically food, right? Well, if we look at our lives, we do the same. I looked up some statistics just this last year alone. Here in America, just in America, we wasted $218 billion in food. Food that we just let rot, go to waste. While there's thousands of people that are starving every day. So when he says your riches will rot, he's talking to us. How many of us, I mean, I hate to admit it, but if I can probably pretty safely say that if I were to go home and check my fridge, I'd probably find something growing in the back that I don't know what it is. So it's wasteful. And this is what he's asking us to examine, right? Another thing he talks about is our clothing. He says your clothing will be moth-eaten. When I was going over these notes with my wife the other night, I'm like, one of the examples I used was like, how many shoes does a woman really need? And she's all, not enough. Have you seen Dillard's new lineup lately? So I'll step away from that topic. I won't talk about your shoes, ladies, but I'll talk about us guys. How many times have you looked in your closet and found something in there that you can't remember the last time you wore? Guilty, right? We all have clothes that we don't wear. And what do? We take our clothes, we take all of this excess, and we run out of room in our closets and in our garage, so we go and we rent storage units so that we can store it more, right? So we can just hoard more and get more stuff, and it just goes and we don't wear it. Some of the clothes I have in my closet probably don't even fit me anymore, and yet I'm still holding on to them. I don't know why. The third thing that James addresses here is money. He says your gold and silver will rust. Well, we can honestly say that gold and silver don't actually rust. They might get tarnished, but they don't rust. But what he's talking about here is he's talking about our riches. It's our wealth that we're stockpiling. How many of you had a 401k or a retirement plan take a beating this last month? Right? I mean, we put our wealth in financial institutions and in the stock market and investments, and they're volatile. We trust in those things to someday be there when we need it, and that's not where our trust should be. It could disappear like that. I mean, we've seen that recently with the stock market. The thing is, we're hoarding wealth while there's other people that are living in poverty. This is what James is addressing. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17 through 19, he says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves. It also reminds me of Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, where it says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, moth and rust can destroy, but instead lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and rust can't destroy, thieves can't steal. Because it says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. See, James isn't saying not to save for the future. He's not saying Don't save, don't set up a savings account so that you can send your kids to college, or to save up and set aside for a rainy day. I mean, we should all have that emergency fund. I mean, because things like Hurricane Ian happen, right? I mean, stuff happens, life happens, and we should try to be prepared. That's being wise stewards with what's been given to us. But the thing we need to do is make sure that our hope and our trust isn't in those things, in those savings. The second area that James addresses, the second wrong attitude, is what I call the sin of stealing. It says that if the first one was what's mine is mine, this one is what's yours is mine. I like it, I want it, I'm going to do whatever I can to get it, right? And we see this in verses 4 through 6, where it says, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You've lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you." In that day and age, it was common because everything was agricultural, and stuff was dealt with on a daily basis. So if there was a laborer that worked in your field, they expected to get paid that day. Maybe not necessarily in money, but maybe in some of the grain or some of the produce, so that they could feed their family. And what would happen was the employers, the landowners and the business owners of the time, they knew all the loopholes. They know how to work the system to keep back as much as possible from the workers. And in the process, what would happen was people would go hungry. Their family would starve because they were deprived of what was their just due. In the same way, this happens in our culture in our day and age as well. I used to be a general contractor. I had a construction company, and I can speak for that industry. I know it's rampant in all industries, but especially in construction, it's very common to, the loopholes. You know exactly what the minimum wage is for this type of role, this type of job, and you're going to pay your worker the minimum you can get away with paying them, because that's more profit for your business, right? That's good business sense. But in the process, most of those wages that we pay, they're below poverty level. We're depriving them of making a decent earning, a decent living. In the same way, in construction, very common to pay people cash under the table, right? And we work it in a way that it's like, well, this way they're not having to pay taxes. It's more money in their pocket. But at the same time, I don't have to keep record of them. I can pay them a smaller amount. It doesn't cost me as much to pay them under the table, and I don't have to pay them benefits or anything else. It's a way of working the system to deprive them of what they should be getting paid. We see this also in a lot of retail stores, right? Anyone ever work retail? What's really common right now is they'll hire a lot of employees, but they keep their hours down to part-time. If you get a part-time position, you're lucky, because that way they don't have to pay you benefits, right? And the fact is, we live in an age where, especially if you have a family and you have kids and everything else, you need those benefits. And it's so hard. I mean, people are working hard to try to earn a living. And whether you're a business owner or just even an employer or a supervisor or whatever, we have this ability where we can promote people or make sure that they get a fair wage. But oftentimes, because it's business, that's what we tell ourselves, it's business, we'll give them the littlest amount possible. And the fact is, what James is trying to say here is that if we have the ability, if people that work for us, if they rely on us for their living, as Christians, we should not engage in those practices. We should be treating them fairly. We should be treating them honestly and giving them a fair wage, making sure that the Bible says the laborer is worthy of their wages, right? See, the fact is, we're either going to love money and use people, or we're going to use money to love people. I'll say that again. We either love money and use people, or we're going to use money to love people. I think, for example, of the story in the Old Testament of Boaz. Anyone familiar with the story of Boaz and Ruth? One of my favorite Old Testament stories, because in that culture, Ruth, she was a widow. And in that culture, if you were a widow and you didn't have family to take care of you, you were pretty much destitute. You were homeless. And so she follows her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law and her, they're the only ones that they have. They don't have any other family to take care of them. And they go back to Israel. And so Ruth is a stranger. She doesn't know anyone there. And they would go out into the fields after the harvesters had gathered all the wheat, and they would try to pick up the scraps, whatever had dropped on the ground, and hope that they could gather enough to eat for the day. And Boaz is a wealthy landowner. He has lots of land and cattle and everything, and he sees that Ruth and some of these other homeless people are out there gathering the droppings, and he pulls his workers aside. He's like, hey, see that woman and all the others that are out there? Make sure that they have enough to eat. In fact, this area over here, don't even gather it. Just leave that there so that they can make sure that they're blessed and that they have food to eat. Oh, and while you're at it, when you take your afternoon break and you go sit in the shade, let them sit in the shade with you because it's hot out there. And make sure that they have water to drink. And last but not least, he charged all of his employees, make sure nothing bad happens to them. These are women out there working. It's your responsibility to make sure that they're protected. He didn't have to do that. I mean, here's a wealthy, I'm sure all the other landowners at the time were like, what, are you crazy? I mean, that's not good business sense to leave some of your harvest out in the field for people. You're losing profit. Boaz was like, no, I'm blessed. God has blessed me to be a blessing. And because of that, God blessed him even more. In fact, to the point where if you trace the lineage of Jesus in the Bible, we find that Ruth and Boaz were his ancestors because of his heart towards God, because he had an attitude towards money to honor God with it. This brings me to the last attitude towards money. This isn't one that James addresses, but it's a theme throughout the Bible. If the other two were to have the attitude of what's mine is mine, or what's yours is mine, we could say the last one is stewardship. What's mine is actually his. It's not mine. God is the owner, I'm just the manager. I have a responsibility to honor him and use the wealth and possessions he's given me to honor him. Right? In fact, if we look back a couple weeks in this series of James we've been going through, we can see in James chapter 1, he said, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father. So all that we have is actually from God. God has blessed us with it. We don't give to get a blessing. We give to be a blessing, right? And this looks out, in our lives, this works out this way. This is how we apply this attitude, this view of stewardship. Managing our money wisely. First thing we need to do to honor God with our money is to manage it wisely. We do this through our tithe. Tithe is basically saying, God, you've given me 100%. I'm going to give 10% of it back to you. You're letting me keep the other 90%, and I'm going to honor you with that as well. But 10% of it, I'm giving directly to you so that you can use it for the ministry to reach others. It's honoring God, saying, it's just a simple act of saying, all that I have is yours. Now, this next one is crazy, so hold on to your seat. It's a radical idea, but it's the concept of spend less than you make. I know, mind-blowing, right? We live in an age where we spend more than we actually make. We are constantly incurring debt, and going into debt, and spending money we don't have. As Christians, being a good steward with what we're given, it means spend less than you make. Set a budget. Set a budget of what you have and make sure all of your expenses are paid, but don't spend more than what you make. Don't go into debt. And then the other way that we can manage it wisely is, again, to save and invest. There's nothing wrong with saving and investing because you never know when Hurricane Ian is going to hit again or something like that, or you're going to run into something where you meet someone where they've lost everything. And then you have that savings. You can say, hey, you know what? This isn't mine. And, God's speaking to me to give to you, to help you out, to help you be a blessing. I'll buy groceries for you this week, whatever it may be. Another way that we manage the resources God has given us is by giving generously. And this plays out in the fact of you guys gave $2,500 in one day to the efforts in Naples, Florida for Hurricane Ian. That is awesome. That is being generous with what God has given you. And we do that by, okay, now, again, here's another radical concept. Go home and go through your closet, go through your storage. We try to do this at least once a year. We go through and we look at it, it's like, I didn't even know I had that shirt. I guess I'm not going to wear it again. So go through, and if you don't wear it, if you're not going to use it, donate it. There's a lot of great homeless shelters here in town where they could use clothes. Now, don't give them rags, stuff that's all holy and has stains on it. Give them nice stuff, right? But if you're not going to use it, give it to someone that will. Or go through the storage shed and find out, I can't remember the last time I used that jet ski, right? Sell it. Sell it and donate the money to ministries. I mean, Aspire Church is in contact with several really good Christian ministries in Tucson that are doing awesome work in the lives of people that need it. So go through, look at, we have so much that we're storing, we're stockpiling. Clean house. Save yourself a monthly rental at one of those U-Haul storage places. Get rid of everything and give the money to someone that can use it. If you're familiar with Spider-Man, his real name was Peter Parker, right? And he had an uncle called Uncle Ben. And Uncle Ben challenged Peter Parker once, and I'm going to challenge you guys with the same thing. Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, he says, with great power comes great responsibility. And in the same way, I would challenge you with great blessings come great responsibility. God has blessed us tremendously. It's easy to look at ourselves and say, I don't have as much as this person. But we can look at our lives and say, yeah, but I'm blessed. God has blessed me. God has blessed you. And with that comes the responsibility of being those faithful stewards with what God has given us. Now, if on the other hand, this message, you came to church, maybe this is your first time here, or you're relatively new and you're kind of like, I knew they were going to talk about money soon. And maybe this whole concept of honoring God and having the attitude towards money that it's not mine, it's not ours, it's God's. That maybe this is all new to you, and I would encourage you to press into that. Press into that discomfort and that unknown and of what are you talking about? Maybe for you, the whole concept is, maybe you're not even a Christian. And I would say that before you start looking at giving generously with the finances, look at giving your life to God. Talk about the ultimate blessing God has given us. He's given us life. Let's honor him with that. Let's honor him with our lives first. And if that's something that you're unfamiliar with, I'm going to be at the Next Steps table at the end of service, and I would love it if you'd come and talk to me. I would love to talk through what that looks like with you. And all of us, we have the ability. We can all take something in our lives where we're blessed, and we can be a blessing to others. Because we don't want to use people and love money. We want to use the money to love people, right?
I will sing of the goodness of God.